Hey everyone, today's video is going to be all about talking about different types of guitar tracks in terms of how they fit into your mix. So that could be a lead guitar track, it could be a rhythm guitar track, it could be a guitar track that's supposed to sit in the backdrop of your mix. We're going to be talking about all of those, not necessarily how to achieve one particular tone, but more about how to consider fulfilling those functions within your mix. Before we get started though, if you're interested in seeing more mixing content like this in the future, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell if you're interested in getting updates on all future uploads. I want to start with lead guitar today, so let's take a look at this first example. You'll notice I actually have two tracks set up for this lead guitar, but to get started, let's go ahead and take a look at the channel strip for one of them. I recorded this guitar track as a DI track, so direct input into my interface, meaning that I didn't record with a microphone from a guitar amp. That being said, if you do want it to sound like it was recorded in a room with an amplifier, you kind of have to do some things within Logic to emulate that. These ways of emulating a real room recording of a guitar track are going to carry over to all of our different guitar functions, so this is the only time we're going to have to talk about these plugins. As my first insert here, I've set up the pedal board. So this would be emulating an analog pedal that you actually have like sitting on your floor as you record through your guitar amp. First, I want to listen to the guitar track without the pedals active. Something very noticeable about a clean, unprocessed guitar line is that it's very dynamic. So you have to ask yourself if you want to do anything about those dynamics or lessen the distance between those highest peak moments and those lowest moments in volume. There's no one right way to do this, but for lead guitar, I prefer a much more compressed guitar line so that those quieter moments still stand right out front where I want them to be. We can accomplish this with a compressor. Now on the pedal board here, I have the squash compressor active. Now this is a very obvious compression and it's not very customizable. So if you want to really get in depth into the compression, you can use the stock plugin compressor, which I have a video on if you want to learn more about all the different components of that. Something that you should really consider for lead guitar lines is saturation or distortion. Okay, so that's squishing the signal to a much more extreme extent and really flattening out the dynamics, but also flattening out the EQ distribution. Okay, that way you're always kind of hearing the tone that you eventually will want out of this at a consistent level. You have many options at your disposal here. I'm using the Fuzz machine pedal, which is a lot of distortion, but tends to have a bit of a thinner tone, not as much low end involved. There are lots of options when it comes to distortion pedals here. There's the grinder pedal, there's this rock distortion pedal. Just experiment around with some of those. Try to find one that gets the tone close to what you're looking for, and we can always fine tune it later. If you want to experiment with something outside of just distortion, there are plenty of other pedals here. There are phasers, flangers, chorus effects, etc. I actually have some videos covering chorus and flanger effects. So if you're interested in learning more about those, be sure to check them out. When you do set your distortion pedal settings, pay very close attention to the tone knob on your distortion pedal. This is going to give you the general EQ distribution that you're going to end up with. So really do try to listen with the rest of the mix and try to get it to a point where it's really sitting where you want to before we fine tune it with an EQ later. Now that we've kind of talked about establishing your general dynamics and tone, let's talk about the amp emulator in Logic. This is purely your decision in terms of what amp you decide to use, but if you come down here to the drop-down menu at the top of the plugin, you actually have a lot of presets that you can choose from. And not really even presets, it's just the amp sim itself that you're choosing. So if you're going for a clean guitar, you might want to browse through these. If you're going distorted like I am, you might want to browse through these options. This amp sim allows you to do a few different things at this stage of the game. You can affect the gain into this amplifier. Okay, so that's some saturation that you could be adding. Think about that. You have an EQ available to you, so just general EQ changes, not fine tuning at all. You have some effects. I tend to turn these off. I tend to apply the effects either at the pedalboard level or in a bus later on. Again, experiment, see what sounds right. You also have a chance to affect some more EQ with the presence knob here at the end. That's just impacting higher frequencies, those frequencies that really make something feel up close and present. And finally, you have your master output volume. So just be sure to set that to a point where you have plenty of headroom to work with in your guitar track. The last major decision you really have to make here is your mic placement. Okay, so it's just emulated placement. It's not actual mic placement, but it is still important to set in the amp sim. This is important because if you move your microphone closer to the speaker, you're actually getting more bass frequency in that signal. You can also move the microphone sideways away from the center of the speaker cone, and when you do this, you're actually going to get fewer mid and high frequencies. So I want something that's very full in tone. I want something very powerful, so I want to get as much bass frequency as I can up front and close to the speaker cone. And I also want it to be able to stand out and cut through at a particular point in those high mids, so I'm going to keep it center for that reason. Now that we have our inserts taken care of for this guitar track, let's take a listen to just this track centered with the rest of the mix. You're probably noticing this sounds a lot weaker than the original example I played at the beginning of the video. And that's because this is a mono track at this point, just front and center, no panning involved. That might be the sound that you're looking for, something more thin, something more one-dimensional. That's how you would achieve it. Okay, you would leave it here front and center, and you wouldn't put any widening effect on it. If you do want a wider sounding guitar line, what you can do is when you're recording, you can record multiple takes, like the ones that I have here. Try to get each of those takes very, very close to one another. And what you can do is you can take a similar track, not the same one, not the same performance, and you can put it on a track right below and pan one to the left and one to the right. In this case, I have my left channel pan to -40 and my right channel pan to +40. What do you have to consider when choosing the amount of panning? When you start to pan too close, you're going to start noticing some flanging effect. Okay, so you're going to really notice that short amount of delay time between both your tracks. Let's take a listen to what that sounds like. What that did, especially at the very beginning, is it gave it a very spacey and metallic sound. A lot of the times you're going to see people panning guitar tracks hard left and hard right. And that's very good because they're very separated at that point, so they're acting independently while still kind of reinforcing one another. The only reason I have my lead guitar at negative and +40 is because I actually have a background guitar that's going to come in very soon, and those are hard pan left and right. I'll explain why later, but I do want this lead guitar to really have its own place in the panning spectrum. There are a few things that we need to consider before we move on to the next guitar function. That is joint processing of those guitar tracks if you happen to split them up. That's EQ fine-tuning for your guitar tone, and that's also applying reverb to the guitar track. Let's talk about joint processing first. When you're dealing with two different guitar performances, you're going to have a difference in dynamics again. You can rein this in a little bit by applying a compressor to the track that you're routing both of those guitar tracks to. Most of the time you don't really want an obvious compression here. You probably want to go with a smaller ratio, and you don't want too many decibels of gain reduction. But again, use your ear and watch my video on compressors if you're not super knowledgeable about them. Now we have an EQ setup for both of these guitar tracks, and this is where you're really going to fine tune where you want your guitars to stand out in that moment of the mix. This is very correlated with where you set your tone knob earlier if you happen to use a distortion pedal. What you need to do at this point is listen to your guitar track with the rest of the mix, and I need you to swipe a notch filter in the high mids and find a point where it's really standing out and it's very clear. I found a frequency that really cut through around 4,000 Hertz, probably a little bit lower than that, but I kept the Q value wide, so I was really getting a lot of that frequency around that point. I also placed a boost at 2,000, so a harmonic below that really clear frequency. Finally, you want to consider what you don't need from that original guitar tone. So here I happen to have a low cut filter all the way up at 300 Hertz, and that's because all that frequency below that point wasn't really giving this guitar line any energy that it didn't already have. And it's also allowing more room for low-end instruments that are happening simultaneously. Finally, we need to talk about reverb. So this is really giving us an emulation of what it would have been like to record this guitar in an actual room through an amplifier. I have a large room reverb setup that I use as a send for a lot of different instruments on this song. So what I did is I actually sent this guitar track to that room so that it sounds like it was recorded in the same environment as everything else. If you're not very familiar with Space Designer or certain reverb parameters, be sure to check out my video series on Space Designer. It's going to make everything seem a lot more clear. The important part here is setting how much of that reverb signal you want to be a part of this guitar line. So I come over here to this send knob that affects the amount of that reverb signal that's actually being combined with my dry signal. And just play around with the track, with the rest of the mix, and try to find that sweet spot. Lead guitars don't have to be right up in your face, okay? So don't be afraid to kind of boost that reverb to the point where it sounds like it's a little distant, okay? It's all up to taste. Now that we've talked about the basics of setting up these guitar channel strips, now we can really get into the other functions that I want to fulfill within this song. The next function is a guitar that's supposed to sit in the background, okay? That can be a rhythm guitar, it can be a melodic line, but it's not really meant to be up front and distracting. Now I'm going to unmute a track I had muted before that's a background guitar that's supposed to occur in between the moments of the lead up here. Let's take a listen. So if you'll notice, that guitar sounded much further away. It wasn't taking anything away from that guitar that was meant to sit front and center. Believe it or not, most things are about the same in terms of the processing that we just went over, with a few key changes. The first change is at the pedalboard level of this more distant guitar. Remember, I said the tone knob was a very important parameter if you're setting any kind of distortion on your guitar. Now the tone for the lead guitar was containing all the high frequency that it could. Okay, it was a max tone value. This guitar, I have half the tone value. Okay, so it's not containing as much of that high end initially, which is making a darker tone, one that's more likely to be distant or seem distant when we listen to it. The next difference is at the EQ level. Okay, so this is that fine tuning of the EQ. You'll notice that my low cut is much higher up, so it's a thinner signal. And I've also boosted a different frequency than I boosted before with the lead guitar, so it's occupying a slightly different EQ space within the mix. My reverb send amount is also much higher with this more distant guitar for obvious reasons. It sounds like it's further back in the same room. As I said before, these two tracks are also panned hard left and hard right, so that is giving it a wider feel, also putting it more out of the way. Okay, usually if you're putting something wider to both sides, it's not supposed to be as present, not supposed to be as up front and center. So kind of think about that when you're choosing your your panning. The last guitar function that we're going to talk about is more of a rhythm guitar. Now in this case, it's going to be happening simultaneously with my voice. It's very important that if you want your guitar track to still be very noticeable and strong, so very full-toned, that you also don't simultaneously cover the voice with it. It's very easy to lose one or the other. First, let's just take a listen to this section of the song.
Oh, I'm a little bit contagious and scattered like old fallen pages. Ooh, and a little bit insane, yeah, I'm flattered by old fallen Halen.
Obviously, it's very different than the distorted guitar we had earlier, so let's take a look at some of those differences. So this pedal board is obviously very different than the one we had set up earlier. We're starting off with a drive effect, so this is kind of some light saturation I'm adding in the beginning because I want more dynamics in this. Okay, remember, think about the amount of dynamics that you want because I don't want a squashed audio file here. So I'm not going to compress, I'm just going to add some saturation on the front end. Then I'm putting that signal into an auto funk pedal, which is essentially a wah pedal, although the automation you don't have to write out, it's kind of taking care of that automatically. Now with more dynamic range on both of these tracks, because I did split it into two again, I am going to apply more compression, okay? Maybe not much higher of a ratio, but I do want to dig into the signal a bit deeper because with more dynamic range on both of those tracks, means that we might get into more situations where we have kind of a moment of extreme loudness and then a moment of extreme quiet, depending on how those waveforms line up. If you look at the EQ, you'll notice I didn't really boost anything with a notch filter. I have the low cut, which is kind of cutting out all of that unnecessary low end, but then I had to ask myself, what is it competing with? Okay, I'm competing with vocals at this point. I still want it to be very strong, but I don't want it to make the vocals less clear. Brightness in the vocals and a lot of that clarity comes from the higher registers, and so I considered taking out about 2 decibels from everything over 5,000 of this guitar, and it worked very nicely. So just think about what it's competing with and what you need to remove from it if you want the other track to remain clear. I actually chose negative and positive 40 for the panning of these tracks, just like I did the lead guitar. Now, this isn't meant to be a lead track, but it is going to be competing with that distant distorted guitar later on. Okay, so that's why I didn't bring it the full hard left and hard right. I hope the takeaway that you have from this is that fitting a lot of different guitar functions into the same song can be quite the puzzle. That puzzle is composed of compression, EQ, reverb, and panning. So be sure you're actually asking yourself, why am I doing this? Be sure that it's fulfilling the function that you want it to. Don't just go chasing one particular tone because someone told you that that's exactly how they need your guitar to sound. Okay, every song is different, and be sure you know how to apply these changes intentionally. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them below in the comments, and I'd be happy to answer.